Good afternoon and welcome here to the Geneva Press Club online. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's one of the first real press conferences that we have after in this period of deconfinement after COVID-19. So very welcome to all of you, the people who are watching us and who are here on Zoom with us, but also all the audience that is following us on our website, pressclub.ch, on YouTube and on Facebook Live. We're going to discuss an important topic today, important questions. It's about human rights in Ethiopia. Situation there is very tense. And we have here with us a panel of experts of human rights, representing academics, journalists, and also at least one NGO. And we will discuss in this panel, we will discuss the question of the freedom and the respect of human rights in Ethiopia today. So very welcome and thank you to the panel and to the speakers to be here. I will shortly present each of you in the orders that you will speak later on. So we have Haben Fekadu. She's a human rights lawyer at Amnesty International. You specialize in non-profit organizations, immigration law, legal writing, international relations, and international law. And you also obtained a doctorate at the Columbia University School of Law. Then we have with us Ezekiel Gebisa. He's a professor of history and African studies at Kettering University in the US. And he is also the author of several books about Ethiopia for sure. And he is also a very well-known commentator about Ethiopian politics in the national newspaper and international magazines. Then we have with us Enoch Gabisa. You're a professor of practice at Washington and Lee University of Law, School of Law, You teach transnational criminal, tribunal and anti-corruption and global good governance courses. And you also have published a bunch of articles, I would say, and you're a specialist of judicial reform in post-conflict countries in Africa. And last but not least, Tsedale Lema, you are founder and editor-in-chief of Addis Standard, a monthly magazine and online publication. And as a journalist, you worked with several Ethiopian newspapers as the Addis Tribune, where you were a senior reporter, and you contribute also with stories to the European Press Network. So thank you to be all with us today. Actually, when I say with us, it means that you are about everywhere. So two of you are in the United States. One, Mrs. Lema Mrs. Haben Fekadu is in Nairobi, Africa. And here we are with a good part of the audience in Geneva. So welcome to all of you. And I guess we can start, and we will start with Haben Fekadu, human rights lawyer at Amnesty International. The floor is yours, Haben.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I'm here. What I want to do is basically discuss Amnesty's recent research report on Ethiopia. It documented human rights violations in the Amhara and Oromia regions, and I just wanted to give a bit of a background and a framework for what I think the rest of the presenters will be discussing. So to start off, I mean, I think a lot of people have heard of Amnesty, but for those who haven't, it's a movement of about 7 million people around the world that advocates and campaigns for human rights everywhere. It's an independent human rights organization, and it's politically independent. There's no political agenda, and we don't take donations from governments. So everything that we write is researched and verified to very strongly. We use robust robust research standards, and then we make recommendations around human rights law to different governments. So in this case, we worked on Ethiopia. We covered violations in 2019 from January to December. We gathered evidence, like I said, from both the Amhara and Oromia regions. We took oral testimony. We interviewed over 80 witnesses and victims. 21 of them were women. We did both face-to-face and telephone interviews in Amharic, Oromifa, and English. We used satellite imagery, media, documentation. We really did everything we could to ensure that our facts were correct, just in case there are any questions about the methodology. We always do give governments a right of reply. We also did interview certain government officials, and we did give Ethiopian government the right of reply and let them know that this report was coming, and try to incorporate their opinions and finding and their statements in the document whenever we could. So I guess now I'll just quickly go into a background on Ethiopia. I'm sure people here are very familiar, but just in case. In the past 2 years, we've seen a few human rights reforms since the new administration has come in 2018. We saw a return of banned political parties. We saw a release of prisoners. We saw the repeal of really repressive legislation from the former TPLF-led administration. We saw, a new CSO law and the repeal of the anti-terrorism proclamation that were replaced with more like permissive legislation. So we were really happy about that. We see the establishment of the Reconciliation Commission. It was a bit rushed and it lacks a really clear mandate, and we think that that's important for reasons I'll describe later. But it's something that we would like the government to work on. And we noticed that reparations for victims was never on the table. So what we saw was a new administration, but a lack of a true commitment to kind of end a culture of impunity, which is why we chose to focus on security force violations in Oromia and Amhara. The bulk of our research revolves around different violations in the Oromia region, which is what I'll go through now, and then I'll end with a quick discussion on the violations in the Amhara region and why we feel these violations are important and signify, again, a culture of impunity that Ethiopia really needs to deal with. So we kind of saw security deterioration. There's been intercommunal violence all over Ethiopia. We saw an increase between 2018 and 2019 in the southern region, in Harar and Dirdawa, the Amhara region, Oromia region, and Benishangul Gumuz region. In Amhara, we saw a resurgence of the Qamant identity question, which I'll discuss later. And then there's been an upsurge of violence in Western Oromia and Southern Oromia, which is why we look a little bit at, we just look at a part of this, and we focus on the east and western parts of Guji in the report. The responses to this instability in Oromia resulted in a great deal of things, but for us, we looked at the violations. The security forces concerned were the command post, which is a vaguely mandated federal level security force that we saw committing a lot of the violations. They also included Oromia forces, the EDF, so federal forces, and regional forces within Oromia. The violations that we document were quite we had documented a myriad of violations: mass arrest, extrajudicial executions, forced evictions, restriction on freedom of expression, restriction on freedom of movement, restriction on access to information with communication blockades in the region. We saw really horrible detention conditions, inappropriate bedding, food, prison congestion, limited access to visitors, limited access to counsel, no outdoor activities, torture, ill treatment, children being detained with adults, and in some cases, rape and sexual violence against female prisoners, or the threat of rape and sexual violence used as a form of mental torture for some. Our forced evictions were, I think we came up with about over 300 households at least. None of them were given prior notice or consultation. They were forced to settle in specific places. There were movement restrictions. In some instances, there were homes being burned by people who were suspected of, by soldiers of people who were suspected of being affiliated with the Oromo Liberation Army, which is the insurgent group that the federal government is currently conducting law enforcement operations against in Oromia. So yeah, we saw quite a myriad of violations by security forces in Oromia. With respect to Amhara, we saw killings, we did see destruction of property and mass displacement, and we saw the complicity of security forces. So while they may not have been taking a proactive lead in some of the violations that we documented, there was active involvement, or I guess, a failure to protect. And there was one particular area in Metema, a violation incident in Metema in January, where over 58 ethnically Amand people were killed within a 24-hour period. So we see these, I'll wrap up now, but we see these intercommunal conflicts all over Ethiopia, and we chose to look at these two in particular because we felt that they demonstrated a really wanton lack of security force training and accountability, and again, the culture of impunity that we're seeing. And we also felt like they represented the kind of conflicts that we're seeing in other parts of Ethiopia and can illustrate the gravity of where our tension is at in Ethiopia. So our recommendations were obviously for the government to completely stop carrying out the extrajudicial executions. Some of the stories we documented were quite sad, dire. One man was executed in front of a crowd of people because his phone rang. And we have other instances of extrajudicial executions in Amhara and in Oromia, when in the name of law enforcement and fighting the OLA, which completely needs to stop. The arbitrary detentions, the forced evictions, destruction of property, all of these violations the government and the forces involved need to be held accountable. So we are calling for that. We also are calling for the Ethiopian government to conduct independent, impartial, and credible investigations into these violations, which they have promised to do. So we are happy to hear that. But in short, the situation in Ethiopia is something that we're following closely, and we will be pressing for these investigations to ensure that they're transparent and thorough, and that the perpetrators will be held accountable. So that's where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haben Fekadu from Amnesty International, and for this presentation. And now I give the floor to Ezekiel Gebisa, who is a professor of history and African studies at Kettering University in Michigan State, United States. Mr. Gebisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Roishi and the Geneva Press Club. I was just following what Haben Fekadu was just talking about to try to provide context to why we are here only 2 years after the great democratic transition commenced in Ethiopia, led by a prime minister described as a reformist with a popular support and a vision for ending the long history of corrupt and strongman governments in Ethiopia. At the time, the situation seemed favorable for a new political system to be constructed in Ethiopia, a system where power holders would henceforth be accountable to citizens through elections, protect human rights rather than violate them with impunity, and state institutions provide good governance rather than function as an arm of a dominant political party. Now, a little over 2 years later, the worst features of the now defunct EPRDF, or the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Forces rule, have returned with vengeance. Since Haben had listed all of the violations of human rights, I don't want to go into that, but I just want to underscore the fact that opposition political party leaders and their supporters are subjected to illegal detention, physical beating, torture, extrajudicial killing, and most importantly, the incumbent government does more than its predecessor. That innocent people are subjected to scorched earth strategies such as burning homes, collective punishments such as internet and phone blockade to hide violent crime perpetrated by security forces, and guilt by association such as killing parents and abducting siblings of individuals suspected of joining rebel ranks. In addition to the Amnesty International report, the Freedom House in its 2019 annual report has ranked Ethiopia as not free, with an abysmal record on political and civil liberties. So what we dreaded at the beginning of the transition, the return to authoritarian rule, has now become a reality. Even more, on the 10th of June 2020, the ruling party unconstitutionally extended its term of office indefinitely and postponed the scheduled elections of the year until, to use the word of the spokesperson of the government, quote, international institutions has deemed that the threat of coronavirus to be over. So in effect, the virus is going to decide the timetable for the next elections in Ethiopia and for the culmination of the democratic transition. In effect, with no election in sight, it is clear that the democratic transition has been reversed. The supposedly Democrat leader has become an autocrat with unlimited power and term in office, and the specter of a violent state collapse had returned. The question is, how did the Ethiopian politics under the new prime minister come to diverge from the goals of the democratic transition? How did a reformist leader, who soon after attaining power declared that his government would be a transitional one, has now effectively changed the constitution to retain power beyond his term in office? In view of this developments, what is the future of the political trajectory of the country? So in my remarks, I will first attempt to address these questions, beginning with why did this happen? Political transitions are volatile times. Without a carefully crafted political program, the relaxing of an authoritarian grip on power can quickly descend into insecurity. In Ethiopia, the fateful mistakes were made at the beginning and inherent dangers were ignored. And as a result, hope for a democratic dispensation had now disappeared. There are several reasons, but I will just talk about three major ones. First, the refusal to provide a program of transition. Any post-authoritarian period requires a clear program of transition. At the beginning of the Ethiopian transition, the prime minister was implored to convene the major political parties to design a roadmap for the complicated process of change. His response was, quote, "I will be the bridge that ensures a successful transition." When the calls increased, he dismissed them, saying, quote, "The term roadmap has no meaning in political economy," end of quote. So instead, he offered a personal philosophy dubbed Meddemer in Amharic rendition as an ideology of reform and transition, and possibly as a national guiding ideology. Such as it was, a melange of ideas taken from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, cursory reading of classical ideologies, the prosperity gospel of American evangelicals, an assortment of whatever passes for a good idea, it came around too late. By then, the transition had drifted rudderless, producing national disillusionment and Hobbesian conflicts. Dislocation and displacement ensued, and giving Ethiopia the unenviable distinction of being a country with the highest number of displaced persons in the world. Second, rejection of building coalitions of the forces of change. In Ethiopia, the forces of change that believed in and fought for the right of nations, for self-determination, and for self-rule in a democratic multinational federation toppled the military dictatorship in 1991, the authoritarian regime in 2018, and ushered in a democratic transition that commenced 2 years ago. The popular movement that brought the prime minister to power, otherwise known as the Cairo Revolution, was essentially born of the multinational federalist movement. These were the forces of change. In hindsight, though, it is now clear that the prime minister considered the multinational federalist forces enemies of the state and of the democratic transition. Their vision of a federal democratic multinational Ethiopia stood in contradistinction with the vision of a unitary state that he had, and that was rejected during the revolution of 1974, 40 years prior. So to realize his resuscitated vision, he reassembled the forces of reaction and pitted them against the forces of change. With the forces of counter-revolution controlling the reins of power in Addis Ababa, the transition was jeopardized from the outset. The stage is now set for an outright conflict. And third, lack of respect for the Constitution. A constitution is crucial in a country's future because it serves as a consensus document, a guidepost, and most importantly, a stricture on leaders who do not know the limits of power. Ethiopia's constitution, considered a liberal democratic constitution by many, never had a chance to be implemented. The protest movement that I just talked about that caused the EPRDF regime demanded respect for the constitution, not its repeal and replacement. Rather than moving to ensure individual and group rights enshrined in the constitution, the Ethiopian parliament started promulgating blatantly unconstitutional laws. The right of nations and nationalities to self-government were willfully violated as the prime minister kept treating the national regional states as subsidiaries of the federal government. Contrary to the constitutional stipulation that Ethiopia is a federation of the willing, comprising national regional states that are co-sovereign with the national government. The prime minister even had the audacity to proclaim that the expressed will of the Sidama nation for self-government, exemplified in the 98.6% of the votes cast, would not go forward without his approval, even though he had no such constitutional rights. And recently, he has used the COVID pandemic effectively to change the constitution, using a blatantly unconstitutional procedure and extended the term of office of the ruling party indefinitely. These egregious violations have been the source of conflict. Now they are the reason for the potential breakup of the state. I could go on listing the violations, but because we don't have time for that, I will just say something about the political trajectory of the country. Currently, signs of a dysfunctional polity are multiplying. The prime minister holds onto power by deploying the military and the politicized state machinery all over the country. Civil administration has essentially collapsed at the lower ranks of government. The regional states are in disarray, even with each with distinct challenges. Tigray is practically independent and on a collision course with the federal government. Oromia is largely ungoverned, with some parts of the region under emergency rule for 2 years. The southern nationalities and peoples region is palpably, evidently crumbling. The Amara region has been and is the scene and source of political violence. The Somali regional state is the arena of a contest between political unionists and nationalist federalists. Contrary to the official portrayal of robust economy growth, the economy is in trouble. Increasing unemployment, runaway inflation, a foreign currency crunch, mounting debt, and credit difficulties characterize the current economic landscape. For no reason, The Prime Minister parades economic policies sporting the language of the now discredited Washington Consensus. Apparently, its only purpose seems to repudiate the developmental state model of its predecessors. So the brewing instability has led to investor retreat, and because of the COVID-19 uncertainty, investment had dried up and economic activity has come to a screeching halt. For many months, the Abiy administration has looked for a coherent agenda to rally the country. It has resorted to some public relations stunts, including urban sanitation campaign, palace renovation, tree planting to set a world record, and a beautification project of the capital city. These do not constitute a sustainable national project. So, given the Ethiopian state is fast losing its monopoly on violence, with armed removal roaming several states, what we now have is an emerging phantom state, which is a state without administration, teetering on the verge of collapse. If the state fails, others will step in to provide security for themselves. There is a clear danger that political maneuverings might descend into predatory states in the regions. That is administration without a state. This is the reality that we have in Ethiopia today, and others would add to that. Thank you very much.
We cannot hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for this presentation, Ezekiel Gebisa. I give now the floor to Henok Gabisa. He's a professor of practice at Washington and Lee University School of Law, and he is based in Lexington, Virginia, if I understand. The floor is yours, Mr. Gabisa.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and explain the ongoing situation and putting that into the context of the constitutional and the legal background. My goal in making this speech or presenting this is revolving around two major points. One is to show the existence of the clash of visions between the political system and the constitutional system that the country had for the last 27 plus years. The second goal that I would like to achieve in making this speech is the rule of law that had been one of the demand in the past few years that gave rise to the emergence of what we used to call the reform has been fully betrayed, and the accountability, the access to justice, and transparency of how justice is being served had been fully betrayed. And finally, a collective combination of all of these two is pushing the country into what we call is a surging back to the authoritarian system and back to square one, which a few years ago the people were protesting to not see. So just coming back to the first point, which is about the clash of visions between the constitutional system, which is the social contract of the multinational group and the ethnics in the country, and the newly repackaged and the newly refashioned political party and political vision of the prime minister, is something that has to be seriously taken. First of all, what we have to know is that the country had 27 years ago in 1994 and 1995 had somehow a social contract that can place them in the future of common destiny, that can hold them together, create a federal system which is based on the heterogeneous reality on the ground. That's what we call the ethnicity, the multinational and different culture and different language are the reality that we cannot ignore in the country. Because the Ethiopian nations, nationalities are aware of this reality 27, 28 years ago, they decided to come up with their own social contract. That's what we call the constitution. This constitution recognizes two major ideologies that really fits into the real demand of the people. One, it empowers the people to design a multi-ethnic and multinational federal system that gives power to the local and the regional entities, that's the ethnic groups. So the Constitution clearly admits and agrees with the reality in a sense that the only way for the country to move forward and the vision of creating one economic community in the country is if the people can only create their own structure of multinational and multi-ethnic constitutional democracy. That's the only building block of the social contract. Now, what is the problem now? The problem is that the newly refashioned and the newly repackaged political system of the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed clearly sits not in a good shape with that constitutional vision. The political vision of the Prime Minister is one, to create a unitarist, a centrist political system that betrays the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that Ethiopians are of different language, different culture, different background, but they can at least agree on what we call the constitutional patriotism, or what we call the constitutional order that empowers these multinational democratic promises. But the newly refashioned prosperity party of the Prime Minister, one seeks to introduce a single unitarist and central political system that does not fully recognize these heterogeneous social and cultural backgrounds of the country. Two, because of its centrist and unitarist tendency, the Prosperity Party also seeks to introduce what looks like a presidential system of political ideology, which is clearly and blatantly against the parliamentary democracy that has been empowered in, that has been stipulated in the Constitution. 27 years ago, when Ethiopians came together and designed their social contract, they agreed on multinational ethnic federalism, and they agreed on a parliamentary system of democracy. This, the new party now clearly violates that. So there is a clear clash of political vision and constitutional vision. So the idea of constitutional supremacy and the idea of creating one single economic community, which has been put in the preamble of the Constitution, is now changing into creating one and single political community. The Constitution has never envisioned creating a single political community. What the Constitution envisions is creating a single economic community. So this is how the constitutional system is quietly, silently, and aggressively being sidelined and being unseated by the political vision. And the other point that I would like to add onto this is the emergence of the Prosperity Party is what I call a false start. The party now that's in the parliament has never been voted or has never been confirmed by the public. So the overnight evolution and changing and presence of the political party of Prosperity is that it's against the Constitution itself. So what we have in the parliament now are people who are not being elected. So that's another practical problem. So coming back to the second part of my presentation is about how the rule of law has been sidelined and betrayed. First, when a few years ago, when the national political protest and popular protest had been going around in the country, the demands that have been put up by the people is, one, to have a rule of law where people would have access to justice. There got to be accountability of the government, and there has to be just laws that would treat the people in the court of the law. Now, so since rule of law has been the main concern and the main demand of the people, we need to reevaluate how that's being reflected in this time in Ethiopia. So there are two problems that we can figure out in this regard. One, the tenure of the prime minister, which is popularly characterized as a transitional time or transitional tenure, that would treat the tenure prime minister, which is the tenure system of the prime minister, which is supposed to be a transitional job or transitional goal, should have first prioritized about transitional justice. We all know that transitional justice is more of political than legal, but whenever there is a political willingness, there is also a legal willingness, and there is a willingness of the judiciary to at least offer some sort or some form of justice in reaction to what had been done in the past. But in a very contrast term, what we saw in the last year and a half is that those who had been taking part and collaborating with the system to violate fundamental rights of the people are now being promoted to the highest level of the governance system. That is what we see as the injustice being perpetrated further. It's supposedly the goal of the transition to put stop to the previous injustice. But what we now see is a further perpetration, a further renewal of the injustice that had been traumatizing majority of the people. That can be explained in different form. One, the Amnesty International report that my colleague Haben had been explaining earlier is a testament and evidence to that. The killings by the special forces that had been retrained, indoctrinated in a way that makes monster out of the popular protest is now going around, roaming around local villages, remote areas, with no accountability, engaging in a serious and blatant violation of human rights. Myself had documented over the past few weeks the sexual kidnapping and raping by the security force that had been authorized by the prime minister himself. These are a group of security forces who operate under the command and control of the prime minister under himself. So that is something that we need to take serious. Some of these violations, violations are, according to my opinion, not as a regular kind of human rights violation. These are something marginally close to a war crime situation. And it's very fair to only demand the accountability of these kind of violations. But up until today, in the last few years, what we can witness is that there is no known cases that had been prosecuted before the court of law. So the judiciary is again being used as a platform and as a tool of further perpetrating the violation of right. And the existing institutions, like, for example, the Council of Constitutional Inquiry, which are supposed to be the constitutional court of the country, are rather used for a mere political gain. We can demonstrate that about a week ago, the prime minister, when he handed down the issue of postponing the election, the Council of Constitutional Inquiry had been used as just an instrument to further canonize and politically and unilaterally decide in favor of the existing political group to continue to rule the country without any further indefinite period of time by exploiting the existing health threats. So this is where we are. And to summarize in a minute, there is a clear clash of visions between the newly repackaged political system and the existing social contract of the country. And this is ultimately fragmenting the political system, leading to a state collapse that had been previously presented by Professor Skelgebisa. And finally, the second problem is the rule of law had been changed to the rule by law, where there is no accountability, where there is no restorative justice, where there is no transitional justice. That should have been at the forefront of the reform program. And now we're back to square one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gabiza. And now I give the word on the floor to Tsedale Lema. You are talking out of Frankfurt, I guess, and you are the founder and editor-in-chief of Addis Standard monthly magazine, and for sure you're a journalist and you treat topics as journalists, press freedom and journalist security also. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Mrs. Lemma.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I would not have much to say to add on what the two gentlemen ahead of me and haven't said earlier, but I would like to make a few points on why I am deeply concerned that the situation in Ethiopia may end up going into where we all wanted to fight against previously. And in relation to the report by the Amnesty International, and also the political dynamics that Henok and Professor Ezekiel have mentioned, I want to mention what it is that the combined effect of this is going to have on the political health of the country. I am worried that the reaction to start with the report for the Amnesty International, the reaction from the government is not by way of redressing the report, which would add into further fragility of the state and the country. I do not see the government reacting to this report in a way that I would like to see them react. There were mixed messages to this report. The two regional states, to begin with, where the report was conducted, have came out to say, first, to outrightly deny it, and second, to say our side of the story was not added to it, and all this mixed messaging. And I think that is going to that's going to end up by way of the government not taking this report seriously. And I am worried what it means to be having these cumulative effects of this chaotic transitional period to the end result of this transitional period, where the Prime Minister, when he first came to office, promised to have a very smooth transition. Are we going to that direction? You know, where are these cumulative effects going to lead the country? And that deeply worries me. The response to this report is one indication that the government is literally not changed. You know, there is no readiness to address these kinds of violation of human rights violations that are conducted under its watch and conducted by part of its security forces. And if we remember 3, 4, 5 years ago, the very reason that we are having this transitional period right now is this angst and this anger against security crackdown, against the violation, you know, this wanton violation of human rights perpetrated by none other than state agents, security agencies, and all this. So we ended up having, you know, the current Prime Minister in the office, because there was a popular protest, there were popular uprising actually that lasted for 3, 4 years, and hundreds of lives were lost. Only to end up in the same pattern is what concerns me deeply today. And so I would like to really urge the government, if they wanted to challenge the reports of this gross human rights violation that's happening under their watch, they would have to ask the Amnesty International's report, they would have to scrutinize the report, and they would have to come up with their own report if they wanted to deny it, and if they want to address it. Whatever they want to do with such a report, they will have to start scrutinizing and looking inward as to what is happening beyond the capital city, Addis Ababa. This is one reason why I'm really worried that this transition is derailed off its course where it began. And if, you know, the reverse course is going to be very costly, bodily and politically, for the country and for the people of Ethiopia. And so it's a matter of urgency, for that matter, that the government looks into these kinds of gross human rights violations under its own watch. This is one reason. The second is we are having a very volatile political transition in itself in relation to the postponement of the election, in relation to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic that the country is grappling with now. And we do have other crises as well that are happening, flooding and infestation of locusts, desert locusts in the country, and outbreaks of disease and all this. So Ethiopia is facing today multiple crises. And we only have the government trying to sort this thing all by itself and unable to coordinate support from the ground, unable to sit with the opposition, with different stakeholders to address these multiple problems that the country is facing. This worries me deeply that added to the security crisis on top of that, when a combination of all these things are coming together, this is definitely going to be something that the government is not going to shoulder alone. But I do not see the readiness from the government side to seek for consensus among critical stakeholders on the ground. Instead, what we see is a political fissure due to the denial of the government, and also its willingness to extend its time in office indefinitely. We don't know when that's going to be, and this is creating a lot of tension among the opposition, among critics of the system. And so this is further, cracking this very fragile political transitional period. So where is that going to lead us in the end? Is the question that the government needs to sit down and address as soon as possible. And otherwise, we will be facing a very grave and unpredictable crisis that are not going to be that easy for this government to handle on its own once it's too late. Add to that is the economic burden that definitely is going to be caused by the pandemic. We're already feeling the pinch from the economic impact of COVID. We already saw a lot of people, losing their jobs, and this is only going to continue further. And we have had millions and millions, up to 30 million young people coming back home and being with their parents and being the burden for their parents that are, scrapping the daily bread to feed the family. And so this will increase further the level of poverty and desperation and anger and angst. And so the government needs to look this. It's not just that a heavy security crisis is happening under its watch, but also that there are those external factors exacerbating this crisis, which are not easy to be addressed, even as a united front with a consensus in the country. So I think the government, in position of the Prime Minister's government, needs to consider all these challenges. Where is this going to lead the country in the coming 5-6 months? What's going to happen to the economy? What's going to happen to the young people if they're not coming back to the universities come academic year in September? What will happen? What are they going to do? And these things need to combine efforts together, both by the political parties and actors on the ground, civil society, and all stakeholders together. And this is the time to seek for a consensus across the country, to sit down and hammer out what it is really that is dragging the country down to the path where we don't want to see it. And so this has to be in the long-term and short-term plan of the government. But I do not see that coming yet. I do not see the government's willingness to sit down and have a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue with the opposition. I do not even see them admitting that a serious human rights violations are happening. I do not even see them questioning the Amnesty's report that in any other circumstances could provide a very fertile ground for a popular uprising. I don't see them questioning what it is that Amnesty incorporated in its report, and what it is that went wrong in these security operations in the western part of the country and in the southern and also in the northern part in Amhara region. So if the government is not genuinely committed to look inward, and it has to happen now, this is going to lead into something very, very frightening in my opinion, and this concerns me a lot. And this is what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tzedale Lema, for this presentation. I think all of you had some time explaining very interesting and very tense and difficult situation in Ethiopia. Now, I would like to give the floor for the questions, to open the questions. So those who have questions in our audience, please raise your hands, and I'm gonna give you the word then. So there is one question. Please tell us who you are, your name, and for what organization you work. Thank you. So the word is to me, to Lomi20. Who are you? Thank you.
Yes, my name is Barok Arno Teresa. I am a medical doctor in Europe, Belgium. First of all, I would like to thank you yourself and also the speakers. My question is, putting a right diagnosis leads to the best treatment. So my diagnosis, Ethiopia is critically sick. The disease is absence of justice and full of lies. The remedies would be strengthening multi-ethnic national democracy, solving the political and constitutional crisis, eradicate the corrupt system. That will be the solution. And to solve that, my question goes to everybody, and especially for Mrs. Tzedale. If we are going to just dare to implement the Oromuma vision, which is for 140 years hidden and destroyed in Ethiopian empire, if we are implemented that vision, which is guided by Oromo Liberation Front and Oromo Federalist Congress, would solve all the problems. Do you believe in that? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Who wants to start by the speakers? Perhaps Mr. Gebiza?
I would defer to Tzedale because it's directed to her.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
I didn't catch the name of the gentleman who asked me the question. But to answer it, I wish I was the politician representing the political parties that you mentioned, the Oromo Liberation Front or the OFC. But my belief is that there is no single vision that's going to cater for a country as diverse as Ethiopia is. So there is no such thing. If we just implement our vision of Oromuma, wouldn't that be enough to make Ethiopia a country? I don't believe so. I do not believe in imposing a single ideology that could unite the country, such a multinational country of different nations, about 84. And so, but I can say this, if probably you could use that and to unite the Oromo together, that would be a significant contribution to the stability of Ethiopia. And so how about not wishing that kind of Oromuma vision to the entity called Ethiopia, but just implement that to unite the 35 million plus Ethiopians, Oromo Ethiopians in the country, and see how it works first. It would significantly contribute to the stability of Ethiopia. And that's what I do believe, but I do not believe in having a vision, an Oromuma vision, to stabilize a country called Ethiopia, as I said, because there is so much more to do that we need to do than having an Oromuma political vision. I do hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on the panel that would answer on this? No? Okay. Is there anybody else for a question? Yes, we have one more question. The person is called Emmanuel. Please tell us your name and ask your question. Thank you. I'm going to put on your microphone. You have to put on your microphone, please. Yes, up. 1 second, coming. Can you put on your microphone, please? Yes, okay. We are listening to you. Hello?
Thank you. My name is Manuel from Ethiopia. I am a healthcare professional. My question is, I believe in human rights. I believe there is a lot of problem in Ethiopia, which should be solved because the government is still young and trying to move forward. Of course, there is a lot of errors which is being made and which should be corrected. So I wonder, is it the right time to raise this issue? Because in Ethiopia, we are in conflict with Egypt, and most of my suspicion is it a weapon of the USA and the Egypt to more destabilize the country? Because we are all facing the problem here, but the challenge from Egypt is going to be more dangerous than the issues that you are raising here. So I really want a good background on these issues. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer? Mr.
I can say a few words on this.
Yes.
So the gentleman from Ethiopia, Mr. Manuel, raised he raised 2 points. If this is a good time to talk about this, and he demonstrates, he said that Egypt and the USA is trying to destabilize Ethiopia. That's his words. First, there is no better time than now to speak and to talk and discuss about this. The reason is the political failure and the constitutional crisis in the country is not only going to put the country in a wrong path, but it's going to have a significant effect in the Horn of Africa. A political failure in the country, the problem that Ethiopia is going to be having in the negotiation of the Nile issue with Egypt is directly related to how Ethiopia domestically operates in terms of its in the realm of its own politics. Lack of legitimacy in the country, political failure, constitutional crisis, and the acute lack of rule of law might have a direct relationship with how the country operates in its foreign policy. So there is no better time than now to discuss about the political situation in Ethiopia. So the failure in the country is going to be the failure outside of the country and directly affect the Horn of Africa. And that's all I would want to say.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to react to this?
I can add to that as well. Thanks for the question, Emmanuel from Ethiopia. I think the idea that there is a conflict with Egypt, number one, is not true. It's a fabrication to deal with internal political opposition by raising the specter of a proxy war controlled by Egypt. I think the issue of the dam unifies Ethiopians. Egypt is not going to go to war with Ethiopia over this issue. They might go into diplomatic frenzy, but it's impossible for Egypt to send ground force to Ethiopia or simply to take their F-15s or F-22 to bomb the dam. Don't have the capability. But in any case, if there is any war with Egypt, any conflict with Egypt over the dam, I think it's better for Ethiopia to be united. And the unity begins by ending the egregious human rights violations within the country.
Can I add 1 second? Because he raised one major point too. He talked about the government is young. I personally don't believe the Ethiopian government is young. It's as old as this constitution. Earlier in my presentation, I referred to the fact that the prime minister decided to promote those who participated in the violation of human rights for the last 27 years to come to at the helm of the politics. They have a good experience of engaging in the violation of human rights for the last couple of decades. So we cannot cash and bank on the narrative of giving the government a chance just because the government is young. It's not young. That's not true. To these people, there has to be a transitional justice that had to be packaged at the national level to show a future, but which apparently is not happening. So the government is not really young. It's as old as the constitution itself.
Thank you. If there is any other question, please raise your hands. You can click in the lower right side button of the screen. Yes, Mr. Previous speaker just asked again to talk. So please ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, I myself, I am not totally satisfied with answer of Mrs. Sadale, because Oromo people is a majority in Ethiopia and still seeking and begging to live side by side with equality, democracy, and still begging as an organization, as a people, and as individual, while we are a majority. That is what I say. If we are implemented the Oromoma vision, can solve the 84 nationalities of Ethiopia, instead of just putting shadow on the issues. If we are applying that issue, we can solve it. Please, I would like to even from other speakers extra explanation. We have to dare to speak to the world. That is my question.
Can I say a word on this, if I'm allowed?
Yeah, no, please, can you make it louder? Yes, go ahead.
Can I please say a few words on this?
Yes, sure.
I don't know, first of all, if Mrs. Adali wants to say this, but all right. So the gentleman from Belgium who repeatedly raised about Oromoma and see if Oromoma can be an alternative political narrative to resolve or solve the political conundrum of the country. As an Oromo myself, the first thing that I'd like to say is Oromoma is a vision and values and virtue of the Oromo that really govern the cultural, anthropological, and also the legal concerns of the Oromo within the existing cultural boundary. And I don't believe that vision of the Oromo should be imposed on other non-Oromos. Because the Oromos, what is the role of the Oromo in the current political project of Ethiopia? The Oromos seek to have their own meaningful and fair share in the country. If the national and central government allows the Oromo to participate meaningfully, the Oromos are ready to participate, but the Oromos are not ready to impose their own version. And they shouldn't be imposing their own version, because the Oromos have fought for the last many years to get away from the cultural dominance of the North that had been imposed on the Oromo. And the Oromos should not impose its own version on others. If others consented to receiving and working within the Oromo cultural values, that's okay. But as long as there is no consent, that's not what the Oromos are looking to do. And this is a misguided understanding and misconception of some political questions, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question, so please tell us your name and ask your question, and put on your microphone.
Yes, I am not still also. He told me that a misguided conception.
Wait, there is another question, another person. So please, the Dilsin, Mr. Dilsin, Mrs. Dilsin, please.
Yes, yes. Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, I am Ethiopian, so from Ethiopia. It was a really nice discussion. So I just want to ask a little bit about the politics. Actually, what we see in Ethiopia right now is like the government, the federal government is playing the nice guy, and then the underground, they are telling their police and their military or intelligence service, everyone to hit people. And you see when you go on the streets, police are hitting people with no reason, just to create like fear in the people. And I don't know why the media are so silent about this, because these police people are doing on the street. If you go, like, not in Addis Ababa actually, if you go in the village area or in a little city, especially in Oromia, so they are like just hitting people just to create fear. I don't know why media are so silent. Why? I don't know. I don't see many reports regarding this, and I don't know what are you guys thinking about this, and why they do this? Why they just play nice on the big office when they are in front of screen, and then do very bad things in the,
Okay.
especially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we got the question. I think interesting
Thank
question
you.
probably for. Thank you very much. Interesting question for Sidelined.
Yeah.
Why are media not reacting more?
Thank you, Dil. This is a very good question, actually. If I can start, why the government's acting differently at the local level and in Addis Ababa, it is absolutely correct that the government's acting very differently in the local setup and in the capital. In the capital, you see all the glimmer and the bubble and the big projects and the photo ops and all these things that we see. That is very deceptive for the media, and we also get to be lost in these details of doing this everyday little reporting on what's glittering in the capital city. And it is true that if you leave the capital city, the story will become absolutely different. And I think to my understanding, there are two reasons why this is happening. The first reason is, I think earlier, maybe Professor Gabisa or Henok mentioned it, there is a disconnect between the federal level and the local level. The administration at the local level has been paralyzed and has never been restored back. So there is, the rule of the jungle, if I'm allowed to say that is prevailing in the local level. So that probably explains why police brutalities are an everyday occurrence. And it's true, we have to admit that this is happening on everyday basis. Why is the media not reporting on that? It has always been like that. There is a heavy concentration of media in Addis Ababa. We're all scrambling for what is very visible in front of us. And we do not have, and this is, I'm saying this by way of self-criticism as well. We do not have the culture of looking beyond what's happening in Addis. We do not even have a presence, for that matter. I'm talking about some of the local media, and of course some of the media that are represented by international organizations do have representation in local representations, reporters in areas. If you look at, for example, the Deutsche Welle Amharic service, or even VOA Amharic, these are well-oiled, well-funded media organizations that can afford to have presence of their reporters with all protection to their reporters and in the local level. So it is very easy for them to assign. But it's also, it's not just being there that matters. You can be there and still not see what's happening right in front of your nose. And this has to do, I think there are multiple factors for that. Number one, the issue of security. As I said, nobody knows what's happening in the local level, lower level. We don't know what journalists are facing on an everyday basis. This is one reason. The second is, I think we have long stopped taking local authorities as authoritative source of information. You could, in fact, there are times when you disservice a story because you're quoting a local authority on it. One very simple example is that, there was this video circulating about the burning of either it's a church or a house somewhere in Guji. And I'm sure it happened during the time when Amnesty was collecting its evidence, its report. The video surfaced, and there was a lot of back and forth. Where does that belong? In a normal circumstance, if you have a media that is that's interested in doing that, and also have the resources and the journalists down there to investigate, it's a very easy thing to investigate. Instead, we rely on what the government is saying. Even the well-funded media organizations there quote local authorities to say who that uniform belongs to, whether it belongs to the armed groups of the Oromo Liberation Army or the local police. So it's that difficult. You quote local authorities as saying, we do not have this uniform anymore, and you do the story. Do you, does that mean that you did justice to the story? It's not. So we have that dilemma as well of disservicing a story because we rely on local authorities for information. Those, that trust between the media and local authorities as source of information has disappeared. But, sometimes we try. Are we doing enough what we can do? No, we're not. And it's a failure. It's a miserable failure that I have to admit as a media person, that we are failing local people, such as yourself, facing police brutality. We have to step up and we have to do that, and we have to face it. But we're not doing it yet, and I do hope this is going to change very soon. But yes, I agree, and it's a burden that I carry on my shoulder all the time. Dil.
Thank you very much. We will take one more question before we will have to wrap up. There is one question of Yared Aile. Can you hear us? Please tell us your name, organization, and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Yared, and I'm based in Europe, and I don't have any organization affiliation. The question I just like to direct to Professor Esgel, there was, I think, some indication that there was an opportunity for Prime Minister Abiy to really create a new trajectory for the country, work collaboratively, and Sadat also said, there was an opportunity to work across the aisles to really create a path with a really clear, political program. What do you see? Do you see any lost opportunity also from the political opposition side of things? I mean, there is, let's say there is a lost opportunity from the Prime Minister side to create this path. What do you think that from the other side? Do you think the opposition groups in the country that were there, that were allowed to come back, could have done differently to create that environment? And what, see if you can touch on that. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gebisa?
Thank you for that. And I probably would combine a kind of response to the previous question as well. The opposition also miss an opportunity. I don't think so. From the get-go, from the day one, the government of the Prime Minister did not want to engage with the opposition in a genuine and open forum. That's what I said at the beginning, that one of the mistakes that was made, and that has now led to not only the reversal of the transition, but probably the potential state collapse, is the fact that the Prime Minister was unwilling to share power with anybody, not even share a forum. So there was no engagement from the government. In fact, what was from the very beginning, the Prime Minister wanted to be a king, as he himself admitted. He wanted to be an autocrat, as he himself said it repeatedly. So there was no interest on the part of the government to engage the political opposition in a very genuine, substantive way to chart the course for this transition. Right now, why we came here is to issue a warning. That's why we are here. That Ethiopia cannot shoulder any more autocrat in the future. The tampering with the constitution, the prolonging of the term of office, all of these are indications of rising dictatorship. With regards to the media manipulation, the government has controlled the media, the state media, the party media, and other media affiliates, and creating even more, is suffocating other independent media to present the case of what is really happening. But the fact of the matter is that no media manipulation, no amount of PR stunt is going to solve Ethiopia's problems. What really needs to solve Ethiopia's problems, and this is a warning, that this media manipulation, the government has controlled the media, the state media, the party media, and other media affiliates, and creating even more, is suffocating. All right.
Let Mr. Gebisa finish, please.
Yeah. So there are real popular demands in this country. The questions, the age-long questions, the constitutional and legitimate questions that the people of Ethiopia have about self-rule, economic justice, and cultural independence are real. unless you address them and many more, like employment and solving a problem of mass unemployment and dealing with insurgents. What's happening is not going to be an establishment of a dictatorship, but a collapse of the state. And that's a warning.
Can I say a few words on this?
Sure, go ahead.
So let me just start from the earlier question that had been directed to Mrs. Adale. I think the burden of reporting on the violation of rights, police brutality, and things like that should not only be left to the media. We have Human Rights Commission in the country that is supposed to be the outcome and the culmination of the reform. The people who lead the Human Rights Commission were those who were part of the Human Rights Watch, but now coming to the Ethiopian political scene, we are witnessing that the Human Rights Commission, which should be at the forefront of reporting how things are going and trying to ensure accountability, are now playing into the political scene of the government. So we as Ethiopians should also press on that part of the institutions to assist and support the burden that had been put on the media. The second question that now had been raised is about whether the oppositions had also played their role in charting out a common future. 2 years ago, an opportunity was lost in a way that there wasn't a common platform to co-design what should be done in the country. Now, about 2 weeks ago, we lost another opportunity in the context of COVID-19. In the context of COVID-19, when election was obviously being postponed, the opposition parties begged day and night to be part of how to discuss or how to make this election issue a bipartisan project. But sadly, because of the lack of political willingness on the side of the government or on the side of the prime minister, the viewpoint and the idea, the bipartisan proposal of the opposition parties had been completely neglected, completely ignored by the government. And the unilateral conferring of political power on the government has been conferred by the Council of Constitutional Inquiry. So I believe that the opposition leaders had tried their best, but lack of political willingness in the country is what is really playing us down.
Thank you very much. I think we will have to wrap up in a few minutes. I would like to ask you a last question. We didn't talk so much about international pressure. And is there today, you think, enough international pressure from different states, but also from the UN, for example? And what could be done to make this pressure harder on to defend the rights and avoid violation of human rights in Ethiopia? I don't know who wants to, open question, who wants to answer that? What do you expect from the international community? Is there something you can expect? Mrs. Haben Fakadu? Yeah.
I think right now what we need, and I've heard highlighted throughout the discussion, is more exposure on the violations happening in the ground. I think there are some international actors who are aware of what's going on, and then there are plenty, including certain media agencies, for a lot of the reasons that Adal mentioned earlier, that are not. And I think there's a hesitation to pressure the government too much because it's in the middle of a transition. As someone mentioned earlier, that's something I've heard a lot in diplomatic circles and something I've heard in international statements, whether it's IGOs or different bilateral statements on Ethiopia. So I think what we need to do is actually address the situation for what it is publicly. People can attribute blame wherever they would like, but I think we need to encourage a culture of accountability, a respect for rule of law in Ethiopia, and we need to ensure, as international donors, for example, could ensure that there are mechanisms in place to start that discussion, whether it's police training, whether it's increasing the capacity and the ability of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which is still very limited in what it's able to monitor and document and share with the rest of the public. All of these things should be the focus. Changing this culture of impunity should be the focus. So that's, for me, the international community could really help change that framework. And I hope our report and I hope the discussion today kind of got that message across.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for this last message of hope from also the international community. I thank you all for this extensive description of the situation, of the context in Ethiopia. We can see that a lot remains to be done, that the situation is for sure complex, that involves politicians, it involves media, it involves NGOs for sure, and this discussion will very probably go on, and we are happy to have it had here on the Geneva Press Club live. Just for your information, there were about 300 people followed us on the different media on which we broadcasted this discussion. And on Facebook, more than 10,000 people have been touched by this video live cast. So thank you very much, and all the best to you all. And let's come back to the Geneva Press Club whenever you want. Our doors online, but also for sure in Geneva, are open for this type of discussion. And I wish you a safe, immediate future.